All right, so I've got 9:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good morning, and thank you all for joining us for our May webinar presented by the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative in collaboration with the University of Minnesota Extension. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. I'm Caitlin Wilson, the Education Program Specialist at SFEC. I can't believe that it's already May. I was looking at these announcements this morning and, looking up what our June webinar was going to be. And I was like, that can't be right. I skipped a month, but no, it is May, which makes the next month June already. So just a reminder, as always, you can access the Zoom link for these webinars through Canvas. So if you've only recently registered, this might be new for you. We have a Canvas page so that if you can't find the email or the connection instructions go to your spam or something, I recommend just bookmarking that link so that you can easily access the webinar when you need to. Again, if you've recently registered, watch for the link at the end of the webinar to request continuing education credits. If you've already requested CEUs this year, remember that you're all set. I will see your name in the attendance today, and we'll go ahead and process those for you this afternoon. So next month, we'll be exploring alternative revenue sources from forest land, particularly carbon credits and spruce tops. So we hope to see you there. Should be good. We're going to try to incorporate some video clips in that from a field visit that I did to a spruce bog in the winter. So fingers crossed it's not too Blair witchy, but we'll see what shakes out. As always, we are recording this webinar and it'll be posted to the website and sent out to you over email, if not this afternoon, then early tomorrow morning. So if your connection is disrupted or you need to step away or something, you can always revisit it there. So as we go, please feel free to drop questions into the chat. I will collect those and we'll address them at the end of Heidi's presentation. And without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Heidi Roop. Heidi is an assistant professor and extension specialist in climate science at the U in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. And she's going to outline some learnings from the fields of science and risk communication and explore how we can use a range of communication tools to more effectively catalyze the action needed to confront climate change. So with that, Heidi, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I have a presentation and feel free to add questions in the chat. And I appreciate there's a little less interactivity in the webinar format, but I'm hoping that we can have time for some discussion via chat at the end of this. And of course, I'm happy to be a resource following this webinar if you have any additional questions. It is hard to fit in an entire field of science into 1 hour presentation. So this will sort of be the high level entry point, but hopefully it'll provide you with some good tips and tricks and resources to continue to advance your climate communication toolkit. So I'm going to share my screen here and dig right into the presentation. And again, please add any questions in the chat as I go. So as Caitlin mentioned, I'm at the University of Minnesota. I am the state's extension specialist for climate science, and I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. So a big part of my job is communicating critical climate information to a range of public audiences and practitioners across the state of Minnesota and the greater Midwest region. I'm an earth scientist and climate scientist by training. I've spent many years in the field, having some amazing opportunities to collect samples and monitor our changing climate from Antarctica to the Arctic and many places in between. And through this process, have really been thinking about and critically reflecting on and doing research on the role of scientists as communicators and contributing to the body of research called the science of science communication. So understanding how we can effectively communicate complex and unfortunately controversial topics like climate change and climate science. This is, of course, a depiction of sort of what academia looks like. And this is not entirely true. And of course, this is a depiction, but typically science is sort of showing up in society through this process of being sort of, there's specific people who generate knowledge, which of course is false, but people asking questions, generating data. In this case, for example, what plot shown here is showing temperature, observations of temperature change and concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. We can see a clear trend. This is evidence that there's something going on. Of course, what's going on is anthropogenic climate change as we've increased the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But the idea has traditionally been that people will run to the science. So the science gets generated, the information is presumed to be useful and actionable, and people will just casually take up the science and use it to make better or different decisions. And of course, we know that it's not that easy. And so my job is really about sort of throwing that model out the door and thinking about asking what critical questions do we have about that science can help answer that are decision relevant. So what decisions are being made on the landscape today to help build resilience to climate change, to help understand what the impacts of a warming planet are on the landscape across different sectors, and really doing this in partnership and in connection with the public and with practitioners, folks like yourself, decision makers. So thinking about this whole cycle, of course, this doesn't represent all of the complex interactions societally that influence sort of what science should be done, how it should be done, what science is needed, and then critically, how does it actually get used? And so I sort of operate in this complex sphere here, but really thinking about how to connect different ways of knowing, different knowledge to address this complex challenge, primarily of how we prepare for a changing climate. So we know we've committed to change. We know that the Earth's climate will be different in the past. We, of course, get to choose how different based on our emissions pathway, but we have to prepare for a different climate future. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what information do we have? How can we make a good decision with imperfect information? That's sort of the reality, right? No climate scientist has a crystal ball, and we cannot tell you exactly what will happen in the future, but we know well what the uncertainties are, and we can, through effective communication, which we'll talk about today, help to navigate how to have effective, meaningful conversations. And as you'll see here, often not about the science, but about the things that we care about, that we want to protect in this climate changed future that we are confronting. So we've warmed the planet. Overall global average temperatures increased by around 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. That's easy to say, but when I ask you to really think about what does that mean, it's much harder, right? It's really hard to comprehend even for someone who thinks about these things on a daily basis and understands the underlying physics quite well. When I think about that reality, it can be really hard to comprehend the scale at which this is happening and connect to this. And we'll talk a little bit about this, right? There's this distance to the issue, or at least the issue as it's been framed in a lot of audiences that we might interact with, or individual conversations that we might have with, say, for instance, family and friends. So climate change, when we zoom out to this perspective, can be really hard to grapple with. It's really hard to confront, and therefore can be really difficult to actually talk about effectively. But as all of you know, climate change is also happening on scales that are not so hard to comprehend. And so here I've inserted a picture of a place. This is British Columbia. There are trees here. You can see there's some interesting things. There's some climate change or sort of land management fingerprints showing up here. In this case, this is protected park space in British Columbia, but sort of I care about in this, anyway, this is near a place I love, but I can relate to the fact that there are changes happening on the landscape in a place that I care about. Maybe this is personally, I also care about this place professionally. This is a research site. It's near a mountain where we've collected ice cores in British Columbia. This was going on a trip to collect radar information. This is a picture from the helicopter. At any rate, insert a picture of a place that resonates with you, or where you work, or lands you manage, and it suddenly becomes easier to understand. Maybe you're not seeing a climate change signal today, but when you understand the impacts and risks, you can look around and understand what might be different, or what you might save by thinking critically about how to prepare for a changing climate. So of course, climate change is urgent. It touches where we live, where we work, where we play. It's everywhere. There are embedded assumptions about climate in many of the things that we take advantage of in our daily lives: water in our taps, flushing our toilets, the way our roads and bridges are designed, the food on our tables. I could go on and on. And as we think about how it is that we confront this challenge, we, of course, and I've alluded to this, we have to both prevent further warming. This is mitigation. This is urgent, right? We where we end up and how we feel climate change will depend on how much more greenhouse gases as a global society we emit, how much we take out of the atmosphere as well. That's got to be part of our climate solutions approach now. The IPCC has come down pretty heavily on that. To reach our policy targets and our emission targets, we're going to have to do some quick and large scale transformation of just about every sector. But we also have to prepare. This is often referred to as adaptation. This preparation piece is critical to how we end up feeling the consequences of a changing climate. And we can choose today to be proactive, or we can confront these challenges later and be reactive. And there are already examples of the sort of reactive approach as we start to confront, for example, 2020 had a record number of billion-dollar disasters. Some of those directly have sort of ties to climate change fingerprint. At any rate, balancing this equation, if we are able to get this right, and if we are able to think critically about these two pieces and how they play into one another, we can work towards climate-ready communities, ecosystems, economies, so on and so forth. Of course, as I've said, there's sort of all these complex sectoral interactions when we talk about climate change, right? It's everywhere. There are climate-related influences that connect with non-climate related influences that all come to bear on sort of our physical, our social, our institutional, our environmental infrastructure and connections. And again, these are things that we rely on every day: energy systems, water, land use, sort of ecosystem and ecosystem services, human health, transportation. And so it's sort of everywhere. And I'm leading into the sort of it's everywhere, but so often it's absent from our conversations. And so we're going to get there. So climate change, of course, when we think about how to do something, how to confront this challenge, when we think about how we fit it into decision making to have it be sort of solutions happening at the scale that we need them, we're of course fitting climate science into a complex system of drivers and competing priorities. Many things have their own uncertainties, say economic modeling, population modeling, so thinking about demographic changes, right? Things that are driving and influencing decision-making on a daily basis. We're kind of adding climate science as a piece to this already complex puzzle. And we'll talk about sort of some of the things that make it really challenging to do this, characteristics of climate science that make fitting this puzzle piece in perfectly a little bit more difficult. So at the heart of all of this, really, in my opinion, is a requirement to use, and to talk about climate science and climate change differently. And I'm going to provide you with some ideas for how to approach this in your own conversations and in your own work related to communicating and having conversations around this topic. So on the whole, when we look at the field of science communication, and this is well documented in the literature, in the fields of the science of science communication, the public understanding of science, there's a huge range of literature and theory. But if I just boil down some really salient points here, it's that we really need to start to transition from an emphasis on the content, which is sort of this deficit model where we sort of talk at people, we're trying to just convey knowledge and they'll assume that people will absorb it and again do something differently with it, in contrast to building dialogue, where the emphasis of the interaction is on a two-way exchange of ideas and knowledge, and the focus is really both on the content and the context of the sort of knowledge or information transfer or exchange. And that's sort of very theoretical, so I'll give you some concrete things to hold your hat on here in a second. So just a quick summary of the deficit model. And again, this is sort of, I led with this, is this the embedded assumption that the science establishment, that there's sort of more knowledge and we need to get that to public sources. And if we do that, if we generate the knowledge and it becomes publicly available, then there's just going to be more acceptance of that knowledge. And of course, social science research shows us very clearly that there's no casual progression from having knowledge to accepting it or say changing behavior. And in fact, we know that humans are great. We're really complicated beings, that often more knowledge can lead to more skepticism, sometimes more ambivalence, and sometimes actual outright opposition. So again, there's cognitive and behavioral sciences that inform this. I mean, I'm not an expert in all of these different disciplines, but it points to why we really need to think critically about the role of communicating and effective communication when it comes to climate. So again, the same question, how do we connect different publics to the issue of climate change and motivate action? So to lead in with the challenges, right? Climate change challenges us in a variety of ways, right? It's the scale of the problem. There are psychological and ideological barriers that come into play when we think about how to craft effective climate change communication materials or have effective conversations. Climate risks themselves often appear distant and exaggerated. As I opened with the picture of the globe, the scale of the issue is often used to rationalize inaction. It's too big, not my problem, not going to happen here. When it comes to actually trying to use, say, do climate adaptation, we're asking people to plan for and incorporate different types of uncertainty and use different types of data and new approaches. And this can often be a tricky communication challenge in sort of the distillation and translation of, in this case, future climate information. And climate change as a topic is associated with political, social, and financial costs. And that is sort of the reality that we navigate as we enter into the space of being climate communicators. And of course, on a personal note, there are a lot of well-documented fears, whether they're sort of some of these might resonate with you, others might not, but sort of this is a grab bag of some of the individual fears that we may have going into an interaction related to climate change or in crafting something that communicates critical climate information. So many of us, and I get this a lot, think that we're maybe in the minority opinion in the groups in which we're interacting. I hear this a lot from folks. We worry often that we don't know enough about the science to really speak confidently. I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't know. That's not true, right? Part of this is about building your confidence, and we'll get to sort of why you don't have to be a climate scientist to be an effective climate communicator. And in fact, we need more people who are not climate scientists communicating about climate. So often, and as we know, there is a huge range of misinformation and disinformation that we're navigating around a topic like climate. Often, especially if we're interacting with family, we want to avoid creating conflict, being uncomfortable, or starting an argument. The topic itself can be really depressing and sad. And often when we sort of get to this point of like, what do you do? We're often worried that we can't really have a meaningful impact. And so combine all these things together and sort of like, let's just pack our bags and go home, right? And I really want to encourage you to not do that. But also acknowledge and appreciate that these are realities that we face when we think about how to be effective communicators related to climate and other scientific topics that may be controversial or for which there are sort of active campaigns of disinformation or misinformation. So when we think about, sort of what is the landscape, and of course, one critical piece of effective communication is knowing your audience and knowing your goal. What are you trying to achieve in a given interaction through the development of a certain amount of resources, putting together, a webinar or drafting some sort of booklet or whatever it may be, or drafting developing a social media campaign. This is the lay of the landscape. And I really encourage you, if you haven't seen these are the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication climate opinion polls. There was a recent polling in 2020. They kind of redo it at a regular interval. So the most recent data we have, this is a model. They do poll surveys and then kind of extrapolate out using a pretty rigorous modeling approach to look at perceptions of risk and values and understanding related to climate. And in this case, they refer to global warming. So that process, the warming of our atmosphere. So 42% of Americans think global warming will harm them personally. A majority of Americans think that global warming is happening, and we'll unpack that a little bit here in a subsequent slide. So a majority of us don't have a personal connection to this topic. We don't think that we are necessarily going to be impacted by these changes. So while we may agree that it's happening, it's not happening to us. right? It'll happen to future generations, not in my backyard. People not in the United States are going to have to cope with the impacts of a changing climate. And for many of us, we know that that's not true. Climate change impacts are here, they're now, and they're everywhere. Of course, there's a disproportionate distribution, and sort of how we feel these impacts, of course, is not equitably distributed. And so there's a lot there that we could go into, but I won't right now. It's a whole separate topic. But fewer of us actually talk about the issue. So over 70% agree it's happening. 40 some odd percent of us think it will harm us personally. 35% of us actually bother talking about the issue. And even fewer of us, a quarter of Americans, hear about global warming or climate change in the media at least once a week. And of course, you can probably see where I'm going. This is not great for a topic that is cross-sectoral, impacts us, has, comes to bear on pretty much everything we rely on every day, and is an issue that we need to address and confront urgently. We're not hearing about it, we're not talking about it, and we don't have a personal connection to the topic. And this all can contribute to what we call the spiral of silence. So if others around us aren't talking about it and we don't hear about it in the news, is it really that important? Is it really that urgent? Is it kind of a safe thing to have a conversation about? If I'm in the minority, am I the only one worried about this? Well, I guess maybe I shouldn't be so worried. We're not having these conversations with the people who trust us or that we trust. And this all reinforces the idea that we shouldn't talk about it, or that it's an issue that's too controversial to talk about. It's not a place we can bring into our professional roles or our personal relationships. And so this is the kind of unfortunate reality that we need to try to reverse the spin out of, so that at the top of this, we're all talking about it. And the silence is really with very few people, which reflects the level of concern in the American public around this topic. And we'll dig into those data now. So we often, and in fact, I did a media interview yesterday, and this was the question around communications. Like, well, there's deniers, and there's so many of them that, like, what do you even do? There's believers and there's deniers, and you're either right or you're wrong. And this is sort of the American public. And this is, of course, not. It's too coarse. It's just it's not believers or deniers. There are, of course, people who are really concerned and people who are dismissive of the topic. And another great set of research by the Yale Center for Climate Communication is called the Global Warming Six Americas. And they actually are able to understand how the American public, our diverse public, thinks about and relates to this topic of global warming. And so it's more complicated than a believer and denier category. And so they've divided the American public into sort of 6 different categories, spanning from the alarmed. These are the people who have, there's a little test you can do on Yale's website to see which category you fall in. If you want to go figure it out, I fell in the alarmed, unsurprising. The questions are like, are you extremely worried? Do you think the impacts are, here and now? I can't remember exactly the verbiage, but I fall in the alarmed category as a climate scientist. These are people who are highly concerned about the issue, are wanting to talk about it, all the way along the spectrum to what we'll see is the minority of people who are sort of championing this idea that it's a hoax, it's a conspiracy, it's not real, and are kind of often doing it in bad faith. They're questioning the science in bad faith. There are other motivations at play. So it's not the sort of dichotomy. There's a lot in the middle. And so when we look, and this is all to sort of, I think, help you understand the audience and the opportunity that we have when it comes to this topic. So these are data from April 2020, looking at the distribution across the American public and how they fall into these global warming 6 Americas. So we can see that, and these are change over time. There's some really great interactive graphics if you want to see how this has changed in the public opinion since the early sort of 2010s to present. They sort of track. There's up and down in all of these. But when we look at this idea of sort of believers and deniers, it's not so straightforward. It's not that cut and dry. But thing I'd like to really cue in here is that dismissive, that sort of it's a hoax, it's a conspiracy, represents 7% of the American public. But they have an outsized influence in us thinking that they're a much bigger percentage, a majority opinion, rather than increasingly this number continues to go down, the minority opinion. And where we really need to target our effort and our time and our consideration when we think about how to have and to motivate effective conversation and dialogue around this topic are the people in the middle. These are the cautious, the concerned, some of the disengaged, who are wanting more information, but not sure where to go, right? This is in part related to this sort of cone of this spiral of silence, right? They're unsure because there's a lot of noise, right? How do you cut through the noise? And I feel like that is part of our responsibility if we want to be engaging in these conversations and moving people along this spectrum and making these connections to the things that they care about, where they live, where they work, where they play. It's imperative that we craft our communications for the people in the middle, not the people at the ends of the spectrum. And so just to put this in another kind of graphical representation, 1 in 10, less than 1 in 10 people sort of fall in this dismissive group. And 74% of Americans are already engaged, or they're curious and they want to learn more, right? So this is a majority, right? This is the opportunity. And the data show that these segments, the alarmed and the concerned, are the fastest growing segments of that global warming 6 Americas in the United States. So not only are they the majority, it is continuing to grow. There are more and more people who are just looking for opportunities to have a safe, trusted conversation or information, getting information in a place where they already go or where they already are, where there's a certain level of trust and interaction that they can have, right? And more often than not, that's not someone like me. So nationally, there's also a desire for action at all levels of government. So contrary to what we might be hearing or thinking, these are poll data from the Associated Press and EPIC. And this is from 2019. I don't have the updated numbers here, but a majority of Americans want to see action at the federal government, the state government level, and local and community level. So as I'll point out here, this is a real opportunity as well, because it gives us a window into people wanting to see things get done. And that's a great place and way to have an effective conversation, right? Not about fear, but about action. And we can also see, when we think about how to enter these conversations, data show us that over the last 5 years, recent extreme weather events, so lived experiences or experiences that we're seeing crop up in our own country or around the world, have had the strongest influence on Americans' views about climate change, meaning it's changing their concerns. So if we just look at extreme events and personal observations in these two categories, these things are having a really strong influence on our level of concern and our perception of risk related to climate change. And then I think, interestingly, the third category here is arguments supporting climate change. And then when we look at further down the list, views of religious leaders and political leaders are pretty low on having an influence on our sort of the public's understanding and concern about this topic. And so then again, there's yet another opportunity. So back to this question. So what, so you're like, great, Heidi, there's all this information. This is, the context in which we communicate, but what do I actually do? And I think the point here is that your goal is never to convince people, right? You are not, if you go in with with any type of communication, I'm sort of broadly referring to sort of interaction and conversation in the spirit of sort of like having dialogue and exchange. This can be in a personal context, in a professional setting, in a community setting, where you may be interacting with, sort of local elected leaders, or, insert the thing that you do. And I think these lessons generally map across a range of types of interactions that we might engage in our communication work. So your goal isn't really to convince people. I think we have a tendency to want to go into, or we get an inkling that someone might have an opinion different than ours, and we're sort of we're on this campaign to change minds and convince people to do and think like us. And that is often setting us up for failure. And this is me. This is, I think, number one, and this is really hard to do, especially for someone like me, but don't start with the science. You probably have a great level of fluency related to the topic, to the impacts, why they might matter, why you care, rattle off the facts and figures. But so often that is a big turnoff. It's an ineffective tactic. And even for people whose jobs it is to use science to make decisions, this is rarely an effective entry point for the conversation. We can get to the data and the information, but it shouldn't be the thing that we lead in with. So we'll often hear in an interaction, people start to talk about maybe surface misinformation or things that they've heard that they're concerned about. We have the answer, and our tendency is to want to jump in and cut them off and give them all the facts and figures. And it's not an effective tactic for having a good, productive, and sort of actionable conversation about this topic. So we have to be able to listen from a space of open-mindedness and non-judgment. This is so much easier said than done, particularly when we're armed with information and we are feeling like we have the ability to influence someone and give them all the information they should have and replace all that wrong information they have. And again, as I said, if the person is talking about, saying things that are inaccurate or is misunderstanding, there's an opportunity to have a conversation to correct that. But interrupting and correcting is a great way to shut people down, to make people defensive, and to end the conversation, or to make it all about the controversy and the misinformation and less about the things that really matter. And the things that, one way you can navigate this is and start a conversation. So rather than leading with all the information, is looking for ways to begin a conversation. This is true like on social media. This could be true for a visual campaign on a website. If you want to engage with people, you can think about ways that would open up an opportunity for a conversation. You could structure information so that they can navigate it like it's sort of a series, like they're answering questions and sort of choosing their own adventure as they navigate information if it was more of a static kind of standalone format. But we really want to be tuning in for where are we having shared values or common ground and common concerns? Do we have a similar connection to a geography or a place or an identity? Do we have similar observations about extreme weather events or changing weather? These are great ways to look for how to enter in and to continue having a conversation around a topic like climate. And open-ended questions can be really helpful in prompting a conversation or keeping it going. And of course, it's imperative that we start to connect our concerns to local issues. This is an example from a communications resource I put together related to a special report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in my previous role in Washington State. And the whole report was around global impacts, and we took the global information and then in a parallel graphic made it very clear and explicit what the consequences were locally. And this can be a really nice kind of juxtaposition because we're often hearing about things like ice sheets, but most of us don't care about ice sheets or have no relationship to ice sheet. But if we talk about coastal change in this context for sea level rise, and we show places and mention data from physical locations that people know and care about, it can be a much more effective tool for connecting people to the concerns and to the topics. And I encourage you to tell your climate story. Often we try to disassociate ourselves from the data, and it's about the climate science community or so on and so forth. And I encourage you to put yourself in your story and in the conversation. Use I statements. You're an expert in the things you care about, the things you've observed. That is your strength and your asset. And this is well supported by the literature, and a lot of the stuff actually I forgot to mention is drawn from another science communication expert named Kristen Tim, who's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and was previously at George Mason University. So there's a ton of evidence to support a lot of this work too. And then critically, as you think about telling your story, try to consider your audience. What might be the shared values that maybe you already heard because you had a question that you answered some open-ended questions. Be place specific, as I said, and try to avoid, this is a hard one because a lot of our climate data are sort of couched in these far off future time periods, but humans are notoriously terrible at caring about and making decisions in the far off future. It's not part of our innate, it's much harder for us to do that. And we're also talking about uncertainty as we march out in time, and uncertainty and the sort of element of time, this time dimension is really tricky cognitively for human beings. So try to talk about things now or in the near term future, rather than say like, I'm really worried about what's going to happen in 2150. Most of us don't even know what does that even mean? So those are some good things when you think about putting yourself in the story, but while also considering your audience. As we craft these messages, and again, this is really about practice. It's going to be, you don't necessarily sit down and like map out a dialogue you're going to have. You could, if you knew you were going to be going into some sort of difficult conversation. I'll do this sometimes if I know I'm going to go speak with an elected leader or someone. I'll sort of map out. There's messaging toolboxes online. You can find them. A group named Compass, a science communication training firm, has I think it's free for download. There's a messaging toolbox that can help you kind of navigate what a conversation or interaction might look like. And these sort of effective messages and stories typically have emotional appeal. That's the putting I in the story. They're usually logical and relevant. This is, of course, important. And being place and context specific are really those are key ingredients for an effective message, a message that someone's going to remember, that they're going to be open to having further conversation, that they might interact with you and ask questions. These are really sort of key pieces of an effective climate message. And this may all be really overwhelming because you want to be armed with information. You don't want to lead with it, but you want to have, there is, and I confront this too, was sort of like, I don't feel like I know enough to have this conversation around the climate impacts or whatever it may be, some dimension of this complex topic. And there are a ton of resources where this information is collated and where some attempts and evidence or research-based messages have been developed. This is an example from the 4th National Climate Assessment, and there are regional chapters. This is a screen grab from one of the key messages for the Midwest region related to forestry. And embedded in this paragraph, I encourage you to look, and we can put the link in the chat too once I stop my screen share, for the climate assessment, but they have worked on sort of value messages. They're talking about economic and cultural loss. And so anyway, there are people who have studied this, tested messages, and really synthesized some of the sort of the science and how it connects to values and things that people care about. And so you can then build on and craft and use this as a great foundation as you think about your own messaging and stories. And of course, I cannot emphasize this enough. We have to start telling stories of action and change. This picture may not be, you're like, why am I looking at a wastewater treatment plant? The reason you're looking at a wastewater treatment plant is because this is one of the stories. I work a lot with water utilities and water managers. And this is a great story of action and change motivated by engineers in Seattle Public Utilities. There were a range of issues that the utility was confronting related to extreme precipitation. They were already having wastewater overflows that go directly into the Puget Sound. Not ideal. Citizens were aware of it, didn't like it, and of course, we needed a solution. And engineers within the utility started recognizing that the way in which they had already designed infrastructure that they thought would be climate ready was already underperforming. In the year like 2016, 2017, which they thought was well designed to accommodate a sort of mid-century climate change. So they realized they needed to do something. They were already having system failures, and the utility and the county were already planning to go in and do some infrastructure investments for the wastewater treatment plant. And the engineers themselves actually flagged this up the chain to leadership and said, look, we're not designing this right. Like, we're already failing in regards to climate, and it's going to get worse, and the projections show us. And so we need to redesign this. And to make a long story short, the amazing piece here is that decisions were made quickly and by leadership to actually significantly increase the capacity of they ended up building a tunnel to channel wastewater. And they have made this incredible climate resilient infrastructure. They were going to make it anyway. They were in the process of making it too small and not right. And a few people were able to voice their knowledge, and in this case were luckily sort of heard, and it got incorporated and flagged up the chain, and decisions were made to do and design differently. And there are these stories sort of everywhere. And so I'm sure Caitlin and Eli could probably come on and in the Q&A, and some of you can probably chat in your own stories. Where have we seen action and momentum? This is the way that we can really shift the conversation away from all of the facts and the figures and the science to the like, here's our opportunity. And here's just some evidence-based, to support this. There's science that shows us that and lots of studies that have looked at sort of information and media coverage about climate. It's more often that we enter with the threats, not the solutions. And rarely do those two things show up together. And that, of course, is a missed opportunity. We're not effectively communicating if we're just trying to, basically sort of using fear as a motivator. We all have a finite pool of worry. And so when we enter with or talk about or bookend some of this sort of the quite frankly can be scary reality of climate, and we leave it there, or if we end it with sort of like, here's what we can do, that helps to limit the sort of we have this finite pool of worry. So this is a way to confront and combat that. And also it can be really discouraging. I don't know about you all, but I talk about climate every day. I think about climate every day. I help all sorts of scales of government and individuals do something about climate, and I still get discouraged, right? I still get discouraged. And so I have to come back to these stories of action and the solutions and think about all the champions of change that I know. Some of you are probably on this webinar who are doing the really hard, important, critical work to do something to confront this challenge. And of course, if we want to change people's behaviors, we want to know that we're going to have a positive impact and that we're going to likely to be successful if we try to do something differently. And this is where bringing in like case studies, this is common in adaptation. And I know you've had exposure to the different adaptation planning tools and things like that. Building on case studies and learnings from that and showing how, even if it's been incremental success, that's really important to weave into our narratives. And then I'll just sort of, I'm nearing the end here. I see there's lots of questions, so I better wrap it up here because I'm interested to hear what people think and their expertise to contribute to the conversation. But it is important that we acknowledge and talk about uncertainty. Climate projection data are uncertain. We know that there's additional uncertainty in climate science, despite the fact that there's scientific consensus that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it. So talking about consensus is an effective tool, but you don't have to ignore the fact that there's uncertainty. Part of that uncertainty is not knowing what global society and governments will do to reduce our emissions. That's a big unknown. Like that's the biggest unknown of the unknown unknowns. That's the thing. That what are we going to do? What emissions pathway will we be on? There's also a lot of intentionally created uncertainty and misinformation around the topic. And so it can be, we sort of got to confront that and think about how to navigate that. And of course, we're just really not comfortable making decisions when there's uncertainty. And a lot of folks would rather wait and see. And again, this is where the sort of actions and solutions piece can be really powerful in overcoming this tendency to say, well, I just don't know that we know enough. And I confront this often in professional contexts where I'm helping like with an integrated resource plan or something like that, where like real dollar investments are being made. And the idea of wait and see is just incredibly costly. And so confronting both the consensus science and uncertainty, it is really important and more or less important depending on which context you're interacting with. But this is a place where I think there is a lot of active research, but one where we need to this is a place where I go and I brush up my own kind of skill before I go into certain interactions. So I can really answer fluently about the different types of uncertainty and sources of uncertainty. So just to sort of hit this all home, since there was a lot there to unpack, and we could sort of have a week-long in-person interactive training on this topic. But if you want to take one thing with you, my colleague Ed Maybach is famous for saying these things. If you want to talk about climate change, here are your sort of 5 key messages. It's real, it's us, scientists agree, it's bad, and there's hope. And then I add the sort of, but there's no time to waste. And so we have to get to work. And if you want to think about how to have these messages, we can really focus on the sort of there's hope, right? We don't want to just emphasize that it's bad, which is where a lot of our communication effort has been. Screaming, sounding the alarm bells, but not really giving the sort of here's what's happening, here's what we need to do, and here's how you're part of the solutions. So remember, a majority of Americans are engaged, curious, and they want to learn more. They want to hear from people like you. We need to be telling stories, our own unique stories, using our diverse voices and perspectives, using the different types of media that we're comfortable with and familiar with. My partner, for example, is great at social media. I'm terrible at it. We communicate and reach different audiences and connect with our family and friends using different mediums. We need to think about really how to we do this in order to make climate change relevant, to make it resonate, and ultimately to lead to our resilience as a community, as individuals, and as a global society. We need simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And those are your voices, right? We have trust within certain communities. And I think it's our responsibility to think about how we can communicate simple, clear messages that will matter to our audiences, repeat them often, and for all of us to take on a little piece of the pie of the responsibility to start shifting that number of our American public, of those people who hear about and talk about climate change. 35%. How can that be in 2020? So we have a lot of work to do to connect the dots between people's lives and our climate change future. There are lots of ways we can do this if communication is not your thing and it's not a space where you want to spend time or can spend time. If we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when we look at how it is that we really catalyze and accelerate action related to climate and climate adaptation, we need to think critically about how to improve our coordination and collaboration. We need to think about drawing on local, indigenous, and scientific knowledge. We need to be building governance capabilities at all scales. We need to be supporting climate change decision-making in unexpected places, right? Like a lot of us don't think about wastewater utilities, or, in this case, like thinking about our forests as a climate solution. We need to prioritize social vulnerability and equity. And I love that they have here, we need more meaningful public deliberation and deepened engagement around climate. And that's where climate communication comes in. But I will not pretend that this is easy. And this is me in Antarctica. These are boreholes that we drill to collect ice samples. As someone who has collected samples of CO2, and I still get asked, like, is it humans? And these are just natural cycles. Sometimes I literally feel like screaming down these boreholes, and I feel like I'm screaming into the void, or having a very polite, effective climate conversation, but still into the void. And so you will have successes, you will have things that feel like failures. And I just encourage you to practice, to try to sort of take those risks, and to reflect on what works and what doesn't with the different audiences that you engage with, either personally or professionally. So I encourage you to learn, to listen, and to lean in. And remember, this is always a tool that will need to be sharpened and used in your toolbox, because there's a lot we can learn, and it's a dynamic and ever-evolving field. So I'll end there and just thank you all for the opportunity, and obviously for the engagement. I haven't been able to see the chat, but I'm really looking forward to the questions and to this conversation. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Heidi. That was really great. You said a lot to unpack, and it just really brings to the forefront of my mind a lot of things that I tend to want to brush under the rug, like, oh, it's too hard, it's too much, I can't make a difference. And I think it's really nice to be reminded that there are small steps that we can take.
Hey, Caitlin.
Yeah.
You've got something really funny going on. I don't know. I can see Heidi maybe checking her earpieces.
Your audio.
Really, weird. Maybe mute and unmute.
What about now?
Yeah, it's about the same.
You want to take the questions?
Yeah. Why don't I do that? Yeah, I'll jump in. So I want to first remind folks to share your questions. We've got some good ones, and there's time for more. So feel free to share not only questions but also comments about
or
your
experiences.
Work. Yeah. But we have several here. So what do we have right now? A really interesting question that came in early on. Heidi, you talked about the 6 Americas research. And someone said, linking the 6 Americas to the opinion maps, it seems really unlikely that, or interesting or noticeable, that 54% in the concerned and alarmed categories is so much more than those who talk about climate change or hear it in the media. She goes on to say, maybe, she believes the data, it just seems maybe people are not talking enough. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think this is the thing that has, so I think we, in the sort of science communication field, and I am trying to channel Ed Maybach here and Tony Luzarowitz, who lead that work. And of course, I'm not even in the same caliber as them, but I'll give it a try, as I think I know what they would respond with, which is that I think that's exactly right. People, for all these reasons related to sort of fear, right? It's a highly controversial topic. There is a misinformation and disinformation machine that's highly effective. We have a misperception that there's a majority of Americans who are confrontational and who do not want to have these conversations because of really successful marketing. So a minority has a very perceived, very loud voice. This is well documented, right? This is sort of the denier, or in the case of the 6 Americas, the dismissive category. They're a minority, but a perceived majority. And so, of course, when there's all these layers of fear, and I have this with my own family, right? It's scary. It feels confrontational. And so I'm not really surprised that people are willing to register their concern in a poll and say, yes, I agree that global warming is happening. I agree that it's going to harm future generations. I would love to see renewable energies adopted, all of these things, but then still say, you know what, but having a personal conversation about it is scary, right? And that I understand, and I think we understand those characteristics of why, but that's why I think you hear a lot from some of my colleagues like Catherine Hayhoe, and this is a message that I have a lot in my talks related to climate impacts, is that we have to talk about it. That is a very powerful and meaningful climate action. Yes, you can choose to eat one less burger a week and that will reduce your carbon footprint, but equally impactful, a different impact, right, is having a conversation. We have to shift that number, because how do we expect our elected leaders to do anything differently if we're not even willing to have conversations with those around us, right? Or in a professional setting. Well, I fully appreciate it is can be a difficult conversation to have. So I'm hopeful that some of the tips and tricks and sort of that background gives you a bit of confidence in how you might enter a conversation, right? Again, it's not about the facts and figures and all the things it's about the relationship between people.
Heidi, sometimes I've heard it said many times over the years that maybe it's best if we don't talk about climate change, meaning specifically that term, but we talk about the things we observe. So maybe we talk about changing tree species distributions, or more storms, or more droughts, or other things like that we might observe. Do you agree with that? And any thoughts on sort of that approach?
Yeah, this is a real tension for me, if I'm being honest. I think it's a really effective way to have conversations, right? If we don't all have to agree that it's climate change, or, I hear a lot words like resilience are kind of out and faux pas in certain communities, or, big door slammers. And so what the words we use are really important. And so I agree that, and as the data showed you that I showed you today, talking about extreme weather, the things you observe, the things that, there's these shared values, the sort of context can be a more important and effective way to enter in a conversation. But I also feel like once we get further along the chain, we have to acknowledge what's causing the change, and that is humans. And there's still not a majority American opinion that in agreement that humans are causing climate, right? And so that for me is the next big kind of hurdle, because the question then is, how do we catalyze and support action at the scale required in order to achieve our policy targets, these emission targets, if people don't understand or agree that emissions are one of the main source of sort of what determines future outcomes related to climate. And so I get caught up in I think about it more as like a spectrum. Like if I'm going to have a one-off interaction, I might not, maybe it doesn't matter. It's like, it's more important to have the conversation. But I think the further I get along, like when I'm working with an organization or a company, I can't avoid the kind of elephant in the room, because the solutions all have to also at some point link back to mitigation as part of that balancing that climate equation. So it's an effective communication tool. And I think thinking about the type of communication and the outcome is important for understanding like how you might navigate through that.
So you've focused your talk on climate communication, but that's sort of a subset of science communication in general. And one of the things that you opened with was this picture of a scientist up in an ivory tower, disconnected from society, sending forth these complicated charts and figures that people are maybe or maybe not flocking to. I think sometimes that there's a lot of power, more power than we realize in sort of just taking people along. Most in our audience are foresters and wildlife managers and others. They spend just about every day in the woods. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. You talk about not trying to convince anyone of anything, but, or maybe that's an overstatement, but not approaching conversations with the intent to persuade, but to engage. And I think whether it's through sharing photos or, hey, this is what I saw today. And yeah, I'm kind of a scientist. We talk a lot in our programs about resource managers envisioning them, seeing themselves as experimenters, absolutely, as researchers. You talked about many different ways of knowing. And I think sometimes we undervalue the things that we as individuals know, whether we're practitioners or whatever. So thoughts on that approach of just taking people along with us on our own processes of discovery and as we do our work?
Yeah, I think that I think not all of us sort of do applied or actionable science, right? And that doesn't have to be in tension with the idea that we need what we call in academy a sort of basic research. And so I think showing people the sort of what you do and the journey you're on and why you're asking the questions is often way more interesting than the data that came out of said inquiry or line of inquiry, right? And I think that is and I've seen this with effective science communicators. They're putting themselves in the story. It's not about just the data. It's about the process. Why are they asking the question? How do you go about collecting the information in the field or in the lab? What are you observing? So I think that, bringing people along and sharing a story is an effective, really effective tool for science communication. When it comes to sort of climate and climate communication and applied climate science, a lot of it is really about, if we're thinking about what do we need to generate that's actionable, what are people actually going to use? To do that well, we have to actually interact with the people we expect to use the information to understand if it's even the right question, right? Are we asking the right question? Are we going to be bringing scientific information that's really going to help you? And there's a lot of interaction and dialogue that needs to occur. We call this co-production or actionable science. There's a whole bunch of theory and jargon around it as well, this process. And that I think is sort of separate in terms of it's guiding the inquiry, the line of inquiry, the generation of new knowledge is done in collaboration. But there is a need and a place for both, and both have really powerful ways to tell story and to weave effective narrative into them. So.
Great, thank you. I want to point out we're at 9:59, but Heidi, I have to ask you at least one more. So I'm not even going to ask if you need to go now. I'm just going to ask this question. And I think this question shows us that there's, I think this is a good example of maybe more of the common ground that if we look a bit, we see. So I can't read this whole thing, it's very long, but basically after 50 years of professional forestry and attending many science meetings all over the world, I've observed many climate models over the past 25 years. None have come to be true. I remember the Ice Age predictions of the 70s. I suggest we concentrate on real forestry threats such as insects, disease, invasive species, drought resistance, fire, generally lack of sound management that provides diverse and healthy forests that are resistant to swings in climate. So I'm not going to continue. There's more there, but the common ground that I see is, we hear talk a lot about forests as natural climate solutions. You talked a bit about resilience earlier. We know that growing trees pulls a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. Forests store a lot of carbon. So whether, and this kind of gets to what I was asking earlier, whether we're talking about climate change per se and some of the tension that you talked about, should we or shouldn't we and when, or whether we're talking about actions we can take, such as all of these things, managing for insect outbreaks and all of these other things. Do those get us to the same place? And do you have any thoughts on how this person who has, through his own observations or her own observations, seen, has maybe some healthy skepticism?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot to unpack there, and I don't know that we have time with your overtime here. But I think the sort of get at the first part of your question. I think when we're thinking about sort of forest management and the sort of climate solutions, like how do we manage for the future? We know that climate will impact fire severity and extent. We know that it will impact soil moisture, and subsequently and connected to that are things like the spread of infectious diseases and pests, and the change in the growing length of the season. That changing seasonality, right, leads us the potential to have, say, additional generations of say things like different pests that are bad for trees. And so I have some data that, again, we're not going to leave with data, but I think the question really is like climate change is going to come to bear on all of these things for which we manage. Humans are part of how we've managed forests. There's no question, right? Land management meets sort of climate meets like how do we manage this resource for multiple competing demands moving forward into the future? And my question is sort of like climate will come to bear on those things. So how do we factor that into all of the other set of complexities and factors that we're managing for, right? And part of that might be the question, I know you, Eli, asked this question and helped to generate data, sort of like what tree species should we be considering planting or adding in to diversify the mix of our forests to give us maybe a leg up, since we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, exactly how warm or how dry or what pests are going to emerge, and what those stressors are going to be. What gives us the greatest chance of being resilient in navigating that uncertainty? So recognizing there's that change, but then thinking about what do we add to our portfolio of existing decision making to make just a slightly better decision or potentially better decision that has maybe lower cost and potential real meaningful reward. And I know that that's not easy, and that's glossing over a lot of things here. And again, this could be like a day-long workshop. We could just unpack that process of like decision making under a climate change future, acknowledging that, yeah, some things haven't come true and others have. And our observations are important guides. But again, we don't really have the past is no longer a predictor of the future. And so we have to start to get comfortable with navigating these new forms of data and the associated uncertainty.
Yeah, and models are not perfect and so on. One
and they
more
won't be.
comment. One more comment that I think is really interesting, and then we really do need to close. And before I share this, if you're watching the chat, those of you who are interested in continuing ed credits, make sure to request those credits. And we'd love to have your feedback. As always, there's a link right there in the chat for that too. Heidi, this last comment, it seems that the greatest recognition of climate change on the Yale 6 Americas maps tended to fall in counties dominated by native populations. This person notes Standing Rock, the Yupik in Alaska. Are we really talking about getting people in nature or recognizing our dependence on natural environments? Native science seems needed. Any thoughts in response?
Yeah, I'd have to go, look with a critical lens at the Yale data with that sort of specifically. I can't comment without having, really looked at the distribution. But I mean, there is most certainly a broad call and a broad recognition, especially in our region, that tribes and tribal intertribal entities, there are leaders in climate work and climate adaptation. There's no question. I mean, if we look at even the 1854 Treaty Authority, they've had an adaptation plan that they've been implementing for 6 years. Right, they're already, when we think about how the cycle of adaptation, they're already light years ahead and in the process of already being able to evaluate what's worked, what hasn't, what's changed, how has the science evolved, how's our knowledge evolved, what are the things that we're managing for, what do we care about, what do our community need? And there's a lot of examples where I think we need to be looking to that leadership and different ways of relating to the natural environment to guide our navigation of this topic. And we have great resources like the Tribal Adaptation Menu. If you haven't seen it, it's an incredible resource. So most certainly we need to be listening and learning and changing the ways in which we interact with and think about managing our landscapes for, in this case, they often talk about 7 generations.
Well, Heidi, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really good conversation. Caitlin, you want to try again, see if you can close this out?
Hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Eli, for taking over that. And thank you, Heidi, very much. That was really great. I think I might actually rewatch this one and revisit and unpack some of it because, like I said, for me, I might not be able to hear me earlier, but this is something that's very easily kind of brushed under the rug because it's too hard or too much or not making a difference. And so thank you to all of you for being here. Like Eli said, request those credits and provide some feedback. And we hope to see you all next month. Thanks again, Heidi.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.